if you imagine a ceremony going on, say at May Day or the solstice or something like that at Arthur's Stone, you have to imagine the children running around and people trying to keep order and people probably making offerings of some sort. We don't know at this stage what kind of gods or spirits they had, what they believed in. Was it a kind of animistic religion? How did they understand afterlife? Why were they putting the bones of individuals into these monuments?
Welcome to the Champing Podcast. Champing is the unique concept of camping overnight in historic churches, brought to the world by the Churches Conservation Trust, the national charity protecting historic churches at risk. Hundreds of happy champers have stayed in our churches that are dotted all over England. So in this podcast series, we embark on our very own sleepover, but with a twist. Each week, I invite a new sleepover guest to join me, Victoria Jenner, to spend a night within ancient walls. Together, we explore the secrets of a new church and the mysteries it inspires. This week, I invite you on a mystical journey to St. Cuthbert Church in Holme Lacy in Herefordshire. Nestled beneath gentle hills and overlooking the River Wye, this enchanting church is home to numerous ancient artefacts hidden within its walls. Enter King Arthur's court and behold the grand monuments to his knights of yore. This church is saturated with history, but none more so than the mythic legends of King Arthur that have been immortalised here. Peer further and discover more carvings from ancient times adorning medieval stalls. Look closely for mythical horned creatures, men, and even a mischievous pup who seeks adventure just like you. Be sure to take your time when visiting, as you may find yourself captivated by all things related to legendary King Arthur in reputedly his birthplace. So what are you waiting for? Let's travel back to Victorian England. Sian Esther Powell is not only a curator at Will Martin Museum in Cornwall, but a social media and podcast sensation, posting under her handle, Celtic Sian. I always go to her whenever I have a question about folklore and the mystical side of history. Hello, Sian. So your whole sort of identity, I suppose, on TikTok, on Instagram, on your podcast, it's all revolving around folklore, myths, legends. Do you think it's important to have an understanding of folklore when you're exploring a landscape?
Do you know what? I think that's an interesting question. I don't know if it's necessarily important to understand folklore if you're exploring the landscape, though I do think that it gives you an added understanding and appreciation for it. But I do think that having an understanding of the landscape is integral to understanding folklore. And one of the reasons why I love folklore is that it really roots you to the landscape. There's so many parts of the stories that we connect with that are still landmarks today, or places that are named after myths and legends and things like that. So I don't think that all people out there exploring the landscape, need to be big fans of folklore. But I do think if you have an interest in myths and legends and you love kind of getting out and about and walking and exploring, then that knowledge of folklore can give you an added extra element of kind of wonder when you're walking around the landscape.
And you live in Cornwall, where the landscape is absolutely beautiful. So you're living with this sort of maritime identity surrounding you. Do you think that's inspired you?
I think it really, really has. I don't want to get too sort of pretentious about it, but there's something about if you've grown up sort of right next to the sea, and especially in a place like Cornwall, which is a sea peninsula, we're surrounded on three sides by the sea. It does get under your skin somehow. It does become part of your identity. And I think going for dog walks and just kind of, doing things like sea glass hunting and little activities around Cornwall, your backdrop is drastic, beautiful landscapes, the cliffs, the sea behind you. Cornwall has such an array of landscape as well. You've got marshes and fields and woodland and all sorts of other things. And I do think it's been a massive influence on my interest in stories, just these places that have what feels like a little bit of magic to them.
I absolutely adored living in Cornwall. And I think my favourite myth was the Mermaid of Zennor, which we have spoken about before, as I always go to you, as you are my guru when it comes to folklore.
I think at the time you're like a modern droll teller, and I've just taken that with me. Thank you, Vicky.
I'm so happy that I've influenced your identity in that sense, because that was the whole essence of that episode that you were in for that documentary. And I think you are, absolutely. And you do a lot of storytelling now, is that right?
Yeah, I do a lot of storytelling. So it sort of started with the podcast. So I do the Celtic Myths and Legends podcast, and I'd do a little bit of analysis of various folk creatures and stuff like that. And then it kind of naturally evolved to actually doing storytelling sessions, doing presentations and Q&As, and then starting to do proper storytelling sessions. And I just love it.
That is so exciting. I can't wait to come along to one of them. And why do you think the Celtic periphery, so Cornwall, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, why do you think they specifically hold so much connection to myths and legends, and specifically Arthurian legend as well?
I think you'll find, one thing I love about folklore in particular is that some of the same types of myths and legends and story beats, you can find them around the world. So you can find similarities in cultures around the world. But I do like to trace some similarities between the sort of Celtic nations as well. But I think folklore plays a really key part. And I think the reason why folklore is so important is because I guess it's another identity marker, isn't it? Folklore is a way to be able to connect to landscape, be able to connect to old festivals, be able to connect to food and that sort of culture and language. And I think that by the Celtic nations, I suppose Wales, Cornwall, Brittany, Isle of Man, Scotland, Ireland, they've got to be able to have a strong sense of place and story. It helps to enforce identity, I guess, but it helps to validate these places, because I suppose you've got to understand that all these places have kind of been in danger of losing their minority languages, been in danger of losing these bits of culture and heritage. So I guess stories and them being quite accessible ways to understand, a people, I think are really great and interesting tools to kind of get people to appreciate the culture of a place.
I jumped straight on my emails to see whether I could get in touch with English Heritage. So currently I am just responding to an email, a very positive email, from Wyn Scutts, who is the Senior Properties Curator for English Heritage, and he is very keen to talk to me about the site in Herefordshire. I have taken a 2-hour train journey from Oxford to Hereford and then continued on for 30 minutes in the car, which has been the perfect way to see and admire the local landscape. Herefordshire lies on the border with Wales, hugged by the Malvern Hills and the Black Mountains. The area, I agree, is definitely steeped in violence, and you can see why C.S. Lewis took so much influence from the area. So there are old tales telling of Herefordshire as a battleground between the Welsh, the Anglo-Saxons, the Danes and the Normans. And the Domesday Survey declared parts of the Welsh marches under its control, leading to countless castles being built in the area. And we haven't come across any yet, but I'm sure we will. This area is definitely steeped in violence. Old tales tell of Herefordshire as a battleground between the Welsh, Anglo-Saxons, Danes and Normans. The Domesday Survey declared parts of the Welsh marches under its control, leading to countless castles being built in this area. Unrest caused the construction of a stone bridge over the Wye River in the year 1110 and fortified walls around the city for protection from attack. In 1645, Hereford saw a 3-month siege by parliamentary troops who eventually overpowered the king's troops. With its newfound peace, the city flourished in other ways, and in the late 1700s, it became renowned for its brewing and cider production. This was also around the same time that rail links were extended to Hereford and a canal constructed from Gloucester, although this ceased operation just 40 years later. So modern progress continued slowly, and due to its agricultural wealth, industry and manufacturing, it basically developed gradually compared to other English counties, which we usually see breaking out of the landscape. Here, it feels very untainted, like going back in time.
3/4 of a mile, turn left onto Arthur's Stone Lane.
It's a very steep hill. It's even called Arthur's Stone Lane. Apparently it's here.
The destination is on your right, Arthur's Stone.
There you go. There we are.
Arrived.
It's just a field. Arthur's Stone looms high in the hills above Herefordshire's Golden Valley, a 6,000-year-old Neolithic burial chamber formed of 9 upright stones with an enormous capstone, estimated to weigh more than 25 tons and measuring 30 feet long by 70 feet wide on top. It is a site entirely shrouded in an air of mystery and legend. Ancient stories tell of King Arthur, hero of yore who vanquished a fierce giant atop this rock, leaving behind 2 deep indentations like burns from his elbows. The onlooker of this battle remains to this day a reminder of courage and power. Here is Winscott, Senior Properties Curator for English Heritage, to tell us more about the site.
Arthur's Stone stands above the village of Dorstone, up on the ridge, and you can actually look down to the village from it. So it's in a really commanding position. Not sure whether that is so that it could be seen or so that it could see outwards, perhaps both. But it comprises 9 stones with this enormous, massive capstone perched on the top of it. That capstone is split into 3 pieces, and that's what gave rise to C.S. Lewis basing his story of Aslan lying on the great stone table and it being broken in half. So that probably inspired that. But of course, it's also inspired an Arthurian legend, as so many places around Britain have. So in medieval times, it was quite natural for people to try to explain phenomena. They might be natural phenomena like Arthur's Seat in Edinburgh, or they might be prehistoric stone circles and stone chamber tombs and things like that. They needed to explain them. So often they would resort to and adapt existing legends, such as the idea that Britain was colonized by giants or inhabited by giants, and then settled by the descendants of Troy, who came along and slew the giants. But that is one legend. It's sort of mixed with this one. Then King Arthur is supposed to have slewn a giant on top of Arthur's Stone, and his imprint is supposed to be still in top of the stone. But I think you've got a choice of hollows in the top of the stone to explain that particular legend. So really, it's medieval people trying to explain phenomena in the landscape. Stone monuments are becoming increasingly popular, not just from archaeologists, but all sorts of people who find that they're inspired. Perhaps they get energy from the stones, and there are all sorts of pseudo-archaeological theories that abound. And you can follow all sorts of sites on Facebook and on the internet where you can share your experiences of stone circles and stone rows and all sorts of things with lots of other people. There are thousands and thousands, I think it might be 13,000 members of the Ancient Stone Bothering community on Facebook. So our English heritage Neolithic monuments attract thousands of people from, not just from Britain, but from all over the world. And of course, places like Stonehenge and Avebury are at the top of those charts. But Arthur's Stone attracts very many people. We don't have a people counter on site, so we just have to estimate it. But whenever I've been working there, particularly on the excavations, there are always people coming to visit it. And during the excavations that we held last year, we actually had 3,000 visitors in the space of a month. So that was unusual because we were digging, but there are always people there. So it's incredibly popular, and people really do pick out that site on the map and make a pilgrimage to it.
From talking to Wyn, I understand in greater detail that we don't exactly know why Arthur was connected to this particular site, but Arthur was connected to so many monuments from prehistory, and obviously it doesn't belong to that period at all. The conventional view, whether you believe it or not, is that Arthur lived in post-Roman Britain and led the Britons against the Saxons. But the legends had already existed in the 13th century. In fact, Arthur was this big Hollywood name of that time. People would have shared these Hollywood romances about Arthur or Tristan and Isolde. Arthur killing a giant must have therefore been the only explanation people could have conjured up when confronted with the great big tours on Dartmoor or Arthur's seat in Edinburgh. These romances gave some sort of magic and reason to great big stone monuments that many in the 13th century could not understand.
Hi! Hello! I was just taking a pondering moment. It was really lovely out there.
Shall we head to the church?
Yes, let's head to St. Cuthbert's.
Lovely.
So I'm standing in the graveyard just outside the church, waiting for Joanne to arrive. I'm just a few minutes early. And I mean, it is so breathtakingly beautiful and picturesque here. I'm sure you can hear the twittering of the birds behind me. It is so peaceful, and I really feel like we are isolated from the village. We're quite a way away. We drove down this very windy, narrow track. It's right next to this beautiful manorial house. I mean, it's absolutely breathtaking. You can really tell that this beautiful church is lying in a very lonely meadow near the slow-moving River Wye. And the name gives a clue to its provenance. So Holme Lacy actually translates as meadow belonging to the Lacys. And so Holme Lacy village existed at the time of the Domesday Book in 1086, when the land was owned by the Bishop of Hereford and rented by Roger de Lacy. And so the story of this very historic church of St. Cuthbert at Holme Lacy is also a story of two families, the de Lacys and the Scudamores. And when we enter, in a moment when Joanne arrives, we will be looking at some of the Scudamore tombs. And over the subsequent centuries, the de Lacys and the bishops of Hereford squabbled over the manor here, which is right next to us. But the Lacys were eventually ousted by the Scudamore family. It sounds very Romeo and Juliet, really. I'm hoping there is a tragic love story in there somewhere. And the Scudamore family came here in 1419. The Scudamores rose to national importance, with Sir James Scudamore being immortalised in Spenser's Fairy Queen as the ideal of chivalry. And the Scudamores of Holme Lacy finally dies out in 1909, and the estate passed through several hands before becoming a hotel. Hello, hi.
Joanne Parker is Associate Professor of Victorian Literature and Culture at the University of Exeter. Her research focuses on the relationships between history, legend, place, identity, all in the 19th century, and she has not only been working on the Past in its Place project, examining the history of memory in English and Welsh locations, but has previously researched Victorian reinventions of the past, particularly the mythologisation of historical figures, so from Alfred the Great, King Arthur, to Robin Hood. And what's more, she's a fan of megalithic monuments.
Yeah. I'm Vicky, by the way.
Hi, nice to meet you.
I'm Leanne.
Oh, hi, nice to meet you too.
Did you want to come inside and then you can chill out for a bit?
How about that?
And how old are you both?
I'm 11.
11. And Matilda?
I'm 13 and a half.
13 and a half? So, Joanne, what is your first impression of this church?
Oh, I love it. I love the way it's it's kind of short and squat, and it's surrounded by the hills and the trees, and all I can hear in the background is bird song. It's lovely. I mean, we've been coming up the M5, and it was so busy, and the closer we got to here, the prettier it got. You know, we got more and more trees. We got big skies, and it's just lovely. It feels so peaceful being here at last. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think its position is really important to its identity, actually, because the fact that it is so far away from what feels like civilization, it's out really desolate, isolated, and as you say, we can hear all of the twittering of the birds. It's beautiful. Do you think that's important in some way?
It's quite unusual because normally you expect the church to be at the centre of the village. It's the centre of village life and stuff, and so it has a sort of air of mystery to it for me. When you come here and you think, oh, why is it here? Why is it on its own? And apparently it was originally in the middle of a village, and then the village was abandoned for whatever reason, and is now a mile down the road. But it leaves it here kind of as a sort of bit of a mystery and a relic of the past.
Absolutely, a forgotten relic. I love that. Absolutely. And I love this sort of illusion that you have when you look at it. So it's quite, as you reach it, it's quite immediately noticeable. This feature of the church is that the nave and the south aisle are almost identical in size, creating this sense of great height and space. And you have that sort of towering amongst the trees that's surrounding it. And we have, I can see some bats flying around now because we're getting to that point in the evening. So yes, can you hear
the bells across the valley? Yeah. Yeah, I guess once the bells from here would reply back.
Absolutely, absolutely.
As we're speaking about the desolate but picturesque positioning of this church, my mind harks back to a very fitting, yet also my favourite, poem by Wordsworth.
5 years have passed, 5 summers, with the length of 5 long winters. And again I hear these waters rolling from their mountain springs with a soft inland murmur. Once again do I behold these steep and lofty cliffs that on a wild secluded scene impress thoughts of more deep seclusion, and connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky.
These evocative words came from Wordsworth's poem, lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey, on revisiting the banks of the Wye during a tour in July 1798. If you would like to hear the full rendering of our wonderful voice actor, Adrian McGlynn, you can listen to part 2 of this podcast episode.
It's interesting that you say it's quite an odd setting, being far from the village and right next to this great house, because actually it was built in a floodplain that was really quite bizarre, really. You think it would have been regularly submerged. So quite an odd place, I think, to build a church.
Yeah, I think that apparently the land was given to the de Lacys by William the Conqueror, wasn't it? I think they drew the short straw.
They absolutely
They got
did.
the duff land, I think, for their house and church.
They absolutely did.
Next, I questioned Joanne about the Anglo-Saxon Saint Cuthbert, the patron saint of the north and the named icon of this particular church. He remained popular after the Reformation, and he is known for a number of things. So he was a monk and started at a monastery of Melrose. He is often depicted on horseback, arriving at the monastery in a rather privileged way, carrying a spear and attended by a servant. He was also a preacher, a bishop, a hermit on the islands of Innerfarne, and most relevant to today's episode, a confidant of kings.
Well, I guess Cuthbert's interesting because you wouldn't really expect to find him down here, on the border of Wales. He's as you say, he's a northern saint. He was at one point the main saint of the north of England, really. And up in kind of the border of Scotland and Northumbria. But it's amazing the way that his story spread. And so, in London, there's Victorian churches to St Cuthbert. So there's St Cuthbert churches all over the country because he, I think partly because in the 8th century, Bede wrote a life of him. So he did a really good PR job on him. And so Cuthbert's story spread all over. And we know that he's been, admired all over the country for centuries. Even in there's a story about the 9th century King Alfred, who apparently Cuthbert appeared to him before a battle and promised him victory in the battle. And as a proof that this was true, this promise, he made a frozen river teem with fish. So there was lots of fish for Alfred's army to eat. Another story says that he appeared as a beggar, disguised as a beggar to Alfred, to test the king's virtue, and I said he was starving, he needed some food. Alfred only had a small piece of bread, but he shared it with the beggar, and so because of that, he then got victory in the battle. So there's all these sort of kind of medieval stories about Cuthbert, connecting him to a southern English king, he in a different century, but it really shows that his fame spread all across England, and he became a real sort of, a kind of icon of early Christianity. and a really popular saint all over the country, I think. And as you say, he was apparently he was very charismatic. So he became the prior of Melrose, he became Bishop of Lindisfarne. He was given very senior positions because I think he was quite good at networking with the sort of aristocracy of the day. At the same time, he also became a hermit for many years, living on the Farne Islands. So he didn't. Although he was very successful, he didn't really embrace the sort of, the sort of celebrity role. He also sort of hid away from it for many years. But after his death, he's probably one of the saints who moved most. His body moved all around. He was in Ripon for a time. He was in Durham for a time. He was at Chesterley Street. He was on Lindisfarne, and was also disinterred many different times. They kept finding interesting things in his tomb as well at different points.
And do you think that's why he's been mythologised?
I think it was partly. I mean, apparently during his life, he had a reputation for healing people miraculously, so that kind of helped him become a really popular saint, and probably Bede souped that up a bit as well in his account of his life. But the fact that they say that 11 years after his death they opened his tomb and he was intact and perfect, also meant that more and more people wanted to go to the proximity of his tomb to sort of in the hope that they would be healed, and he would intercede for them, and grant them sort of whatever they wanted. Whether that was forgiveness or something more worldly.
That's so interesting. I find it also really compelling, the fact that in medieval tales he was seen as this figure who would appear to Alfred in such guises, a bit like those wise, sort of mysterious figures like Merlin that we see in King Arthur. Do you think there's a connection there?
Yes, he's very much like Arthur. I think, in the Victorian period, Alfred and Arthur are both vying really to be the national icon, to be the sort of emblem of Britishness and the best and greatest ever British king. And they both have these mythological, legendary elements to their stories. So there's the story of Cuthbert appearing to Alfred, and various stories about him burning cakes and this sort of thing. And on the other hand, all the sort of magical elements of the Arthurian story. And, the 19th century was a time when they were looking for great kings. They were kind of worried about the possibility of political revolution. They could see revolutions happening all over Europe. And they thought, it's really important that we have strong leadership in this country if we're going to avoid a revolution. So they get really interested in these great legendary kings who can offer kind of models of ideal kingship and leadership.
Joanna's point is particularly poignant here. The Scudamore family were patrons of the church from medieval times until the 20th century, and their monuments are a spectacle to see. John Scudamore, who died in 1571, lies beside his wife on a tomb chest, decked out in full armour. James Scudamore, who died in 1668, wears instead a Roman costume in a great wedding cake of a wall monument, possibly by Grinling Gibbons. And we see them self-fashioning themselves in death as figures of power and tapping into a time that has a particular importance for them, whether it be a great emperor of Rome or a medieval knight. So we're looking for a knight.
A knight in armour.
A knight in armour around the back.
You can help us find it. And it's not that easy in the dark. Oh, I think it might be through there, through the grand gates. And then he's a little bit tricky to see, but here we are. So we found the memorial, and this is to Edwin Scudamore Stanhope. So he died in 1933, and here he is pictured as this heroic knight. Why do you think he would have been so enamoured with this form, or presenting himself as a knight?
He looks like he's guarding the church, doesn't he? He looks fantastic.
A dog behind him.
There's a dog.
There is.
There's a dog at his feet. Now, quite often in medieval iconography, a dog like that, it represents faithfulness or fidelity, to show that he was faithful to his family or his country or where he came from. So I think it's probably his Maybe he may also have just had a pet dog that he wanted to memorialise, but it might be a mixture of the two.
Because the British do love their dogs, don't they? And their horses.
Yeah, I love the fact he's got the dog there, behind him, and he's looking out across the countryside through the gate. Now, I think that's what's really interesting is, he died in 1933, so there's no way he ever wore armour or carried a shield or a sword, really.
Look, one of the bats was up there.
Yes, the bats are swooping above him. It's all very magical. But I think that's, I think there's a reason why he's in armour. And I think it's because he was quite a special man. So in 1915, he was given what's called, he became a Knight of the Garter. So it's the highest honour in the British Empire, apart from the George Cross and the Victoria Cross. It's in the kind of honours list. It's right up at the top, and it links anybody who's given it. It links them right back to the medieval times, because it was an honour that was established by Edward III in 1348. So receiving that honour goes back centuries and centuries. So it would be something that he was incredibly proud of, because there are only ever 24 Knights of the Garter in Britain, as well as the King and the Prince of Wales. So I think that he's linking himself back to that history of Knights of the Garter who were always rewarded for kind of, absolutely exemplary service to the crown or loyalty to the nation. They're part of an elite. They're almost like King Arthur's Knights of the Round Table in the old days. They're the modern equivalent of that, really. So although he was never a knight in battle, he was, in a way, still a knight. And so he's being buried, remembering that and picturing him as a proper knight.
It's remarkable, isn't it? He's following in that ancient tradition, and he is overlooking and guarding this church. It's wonderful. Well, you have definitely worked for your supper. Should we go have some dinner?
That sounds good.
Go to the pub.
Welcome to Fownhope, where the past still echoes through its oldest pub, the Green Man. Legends claim it was established in 1485, but official records have traced its roots back to 1693, when it was first known as the Naked Boy. This historic establishment has seen it all, from serving as a magistrate's court and coaching in, to hosting famous patrons like Tom Spring, England's heavyweight bare-knuckle champion. Even Colonel Birch returning victorious with his girlfriend Roaring Meg after capturing Goodrich Castle, and they spent a night here. But beyond its rich history lies the Heart of Oak Society, founded in 1791 for a monthly subscription fee that covered illness and funeral costs for its members. While the side of the society may have ceased in the 1980s, its annual Club Walk Day still draws crowds every year. Some say the pub's name is linked to Jack in the Green, a symbol of sadness and sacrifice, but I believe it pays homage to John Green, the first landlord recorded when the name appeared in 1707. So come on in and raise a glass to the Green Man, where the stories of the past still live on.
I was quite interested in how pubs and inns and taverns became associated with the Green Man, and it seems like this sort of started to happen around the 17th century.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, do you know much more about that?
Well, I think it kind of started out, well, we knew that by the 16th century, there's lots of references to green men, kind of forming parts of kind of pageants and processions. And so I think as far as we know, I think it was a person who would be covered in greenery, possibly even painted green, and their role was to be at the front of the procession and kind of clearing the crowds out of the way to let the rest of the procession come through. And it might be at St George's Day, it might be May Day, but some sort of festivity generally. And I think they kind of darted around with sometimes with a big club. Sometimes they had firecrackers that they'd set off, and so they were quite terrifying in some ways. But I think the crowds loved them, you know.
Absolutely, really, they brought this theatrical element that really brought people together. I love that.
Yes, totally, yeah. And they'd be kind of slightly anarchic and quite wild figures that were sort of, you know, clearing people out of the way so that then the sort of procession or whatever occasion it was could come through. And I think because of that kind of slightly wild, anarchic sort of element to the character, they became associated with kind of alcohol intoxication. And so eventually you started, I think in the 17th century, you started getting pubs and breweries calling themselves the Green Man and sort of linking themselves to the figure.
But our conversation is interrupted by the arrival of our dinner.
Have you all enjoyed your dinner?
It's been lovely,
Yeah, it was really delicious.
So how does it feel going back to the church in the dark, guys?
It's quite exciting. because you're the only ones there, but like so many people have been there before you, like because it's such an old church, you can almost feel like how so many people have been there and now it's like just us. And yeah, it's really cozy inside the church, it's really pretty, and when you go outside it feels quite magical in the dark because it's such a lovely like setting. There's like lots of trees and birds and bats and wildlife, as well as a very cute little mouse which is just by the entrance.
As we arrive back at St. Cuthbert, the church is illuminated in moonlight.
We're greeted on the right with this beautiful maritime memorial. Wow. Absolutely.
The moment Joanna and I step through the front doors of the old church, we are transported back in time. The air is thick with the musty smell of centuries-old stonework, and shafts of light fill the vast interior through leaded stained glass windows. In the nave is a striking window showing two of King Arthur's knights, given in memory of Archibald Lucas-Tooth, who died in World War I. His father, Sir Robert, is commemorated in the wonderful glass in the great east window, showing St. Michael weighing souls.
Girls, look at the lovely stained glass, isn't it lovely? Oh, the light coming through, it's beautiful.
Absolutely, and I think it really juxtaposes against the stone, doesn't it? It really creates these different colours and...
It's like all those lovely blues that you get in Victorian stained glass.
Absolutely, and the red and the blue really are so pungent.
Yeah. I think this one I read about. I think it's mosaiced from earlier glass. So I think they took some fragments of medieval glass, and then in the 19th century they sort of mosaiced them back together. So it looks really interesting, doesn't it? You can kind of get a glimpse of what it was originally, but all jumbled up.
I think I found it. Here we are.
Yes.
Absolutely, Sir Galahad. So why do you think there is an Arthurian window in Holme Lacy Church?
Oh, I think it might be the fact that there's quite a sad story behind the family that had the estate, really. So Archibald, who's commemorated in this window, he was the youngest of three sons. His father bought the Holme Lacy estate, including the church, only in 1909, 1910, so he really didn't get to enjoy it for very long because he died in 1915. But before he died, tragically, his two eldest sons both died in the very first year of the First World War. So two sons died in 1914, fighting in France. He died a year later, probably, broken-hearted, probably, I suppose.
Absolutely, that's so tragic.
And then in 1918, the one surviving son, Archibald, who's commemorated here, also died in France. And I think the really sad thing, he didn't even die fighting, which I guess he would have, he grew up, he born in 1884, so he would have grown up on those Victorian stories of kind of boys' adventure stories and stories of knights and armour and chivalry and all those ideals of warfare. And then when he and his brothers actually went to France in the First World War, it would have been so different from the stories that they'd grown up on. And tragically, he died of pneumonia in the trenches, so he didn't even die that sort of glorious death on the battlefield that he might have imagined. That in the worst case scenario, that's at least how he would die. So I feel like this window, it probably commemorates his ideal and what he imagined he would do when he went to fight for his country. That he would be a bold knight, ever loyal and true, like it says in the glass. So it's I suppose it's a commemoration of those ideals in a sense that he and the two brothers probably went off to France with.
We cross the aisle and find ourselves standing before 4 towering tombs dressed in marble and alabaster carvings depicting members of the Scudamore family. John and Sybil's effigies are particularly striking, Sir John in his armour with his feet resting on a lion, while Lady Sybil is dressed in an embroidered gown with a delicate pomander hanging from her neck. Every detail has been painstakingly sculpted and appears to be frozen in time. Nearby, set against the north wall of the chancel, is a grandiose marble monument to James Scudamore, who died in 1688, which I mentioned earlier. So the carving may be Gwynplaine Gibbons. It certainly looks like his style. And Sir James here is really interesting. He is depicted in Roman costume, his elbow resting on a cushion, rather as if he has just been indulging in a Roman feast. And he's looking out to the stained glass windows with a very contented look on his face. So now these are the little ledges that people would have used to rest on during long prayers, and which are decorated with these fantastical carved creatures, which very much fits our theme of today, this mythology, this mythologizing of different creatures in this magical landscape. And so these are also known as misericords, which are seats usually found in the choir of a church or cathedral, designed to fold away when they're not in use. And the underside of the seat has, let's have a quick look, has a small shelf that a user can lean against. Can you hear that? Oh, and there's a really big spider in there. Oh, run away from that. That was really, really big. It sort of jumped out at me. It was really big. It was like that big. It's not on me, is it? No. That scared me more than the mystical beasts that were carved onto them. And there is a little horned devil on that one, so that's quite great.
With the spider hiding behind it.
It's like it was intended. I'm just going to check that the spider wasn't on me. The underside of the seat has this small shelf that the user can lean against to reduce discomfort during long periods of standing during services. And their name is in fact derived from the Latin misericordia, meaning mercy. And as a result, they are sometimes known as mercy seats or pity seats, which I think is very fitting. As with much woodwork in churches and cathedrals, we all know that misericords are often very skillfully carved, showing a wide variety of different subjects, and we've seen them across many of our churches within the Church's Conservation Trust. And we have so many different little fantastical figures here. I'm just looking around, and we have what looks like perhaps a phoenix, like almost rising from the ashes. And then we have another little horned devil. And we have what looks like an angel in one of them. And then we have this furry little pooch, this little puppy. I think that's my favourite.
Things would be produced by hand. Churches like this, they loved. They saw these as representing the ideal, but saw them as kind of more natural than the modern world. And much more spiritual than the sort of Victorian society.
And they could feel closer to God almost in this setting as well. That's a famous ideology of John Ruskin too, right? That you would feel out in nature very close to God, and then he tried to replicate that in his artwork. So trying to replicate that within the crafts, the arts and crafts of the church and the interior fabric, it feels like they're very much trying to get to that divine point.
Yeah, they used to believe that the pointed arches of the medieval churches, they replicate the boughs of trees meeting in a forest. So more natural for that reason too.
I love that idea, and it's very castellated as well, isn't it? It makes you feel like you're in very much a medieval castle as well, when the turret's looking out.
I think the thing that I think funny about that you mentioned about the Scudamore monument where he's dressed as a Roman, it's a sort of a reminder that everybody looks back to a different bit of history and sort of in terms of their identity. So he wanted to be identified with the Romans. Archibald Lucas-Tooth wanted to be identified with a medieval knight. We always look back to different aspects of the past, always sort of trying to develop our identity. There's always an element of nostalgia and backwards looking involved in it.
Everybody wants to escape somewhere.
Yeah, and it's great to escape here. I mean, sleeping here for the night, you sort of feel like you could feel like you were in a castle or, somewhere in the past, definitely. It doesn't feel like 21st century.
It doesn't at all, and you can barely hear the road. I mean, we're very much separated from what feels like 21st century civilization. It's lovely.
I think you could pretend you were a knight here for the night almost.
And indeed we do. Our camp beds are arranged in a row in front of the north transept in the nave. I take the camp bed at the end of the row, closest to the chancel, and just before turning in for the night and enjoying our sleeping bags, we ponder upon our magical experience with a book of Arthurian tales. So I've got a book here called Arthurian Legends, and these are retold from medieval text with extended notes. And so we have very famous stories like the coming of King Arthur, the enchantments of Merlin. And now we're surrounded by fairy lights, so it's very magical.
It's very magical, yeah.
Lovely. Well, we can all dream of Arthurian tales tonight. Good night, everybody. Morning. I came out to find you.
We came out to see the lovely morning sky.
Oh, lovely.
All pinky and peachy and like lots of mist hanging among the trees. Oh, it looks beautiful this morning. Yeah.
And you're right by the knight.
We are, yeah. We were having a better look at him in daylight.
Yes, especially with the sunshine sort of very much glowing upon him and defining him. It's lovely.
Faces east.
He does.
Facing east.
Yeah.
Yeah, he sees the sunrise every morning.
Lucky him.
Yeah.
So how did you all sleep?
Oh, pretty well. Yeah. We always wake up early, but
well, not always. Well, most of the time. We have to wake up at 6:30 for school.
Yeah, so it was lovely waking up early here because we woke up and the sun was coming through the stained glass, and so we went creeping outside to see what was going on outside.
You get to experience the best bit in the morning.
It is then time for some morning indulgence, so we delve into a well-stocked picnic hamper.
And so here we have some pastries. We got extra chocolate ones because I thought the girls would prefer the chocolate. There's always a squabble for chocolate ones. And then there's some jam here for the plain croissants.
Oh, I love muffins.
Raspberries, there's some yogurts. Oh, would you like any juice?
Let's get some juice up.
If you would like to make some memories, why not give champing a try? For everything you need to know about champing, please do visit champing.co.uk. The champing season happens in those warmer months between March and October, so book now. Nights in the Nave has been written and produced by me, Victoria Jenner. My guests have been Professor Joanne Parker, and special thanks goes to Fiona Silk, who runs Champing, our champing assistants, and Sian Esther Powell from Will Martin Museum, Wyn Scutt from English Heritage. Sound recording was managed by Leanne Beattie, editing by Jamie Reed Sound, music by Nick Very, and designed by George Allen. Come to a sleepover at our place.